If NATO doesn't offer Ukraine serious security guarantees at the alliance's summit next month, individual member nations may resort to putting troops on the ground themselves. That's the view of the former NATO Secretary General Anders Rasmussen. If he's right, what would be the consequences? And how will Russia react? Welcome to Roundtable, I'm Philip Hampshire. NATO has always insisted that it would not take a direct part in fighting inside Ukraine. However, Anders Rasmussen has suggested some NATO members could well put troops on the ground in Ukraine. The former Secretary General, who is now an advisor to Ukraine's president, said Poland, for example, could look to build a coalition of countries willing to offer Kyiv more concrete support. NATO will hold a key summit in Lithuania in July. So, what are the chances Ukraine will be offered a route to membership? And can Moscow do anything to prevent it? Let's meet our guest today in the studio. I'm joined by Martin Smith. He's a senior lecturer in Defence and International Affairs at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. In Nottingham, we have Colin Alexander, who is a senior lecturer in political communications at Nottingham Trent University. And in London, we have Paul Ingram, who is a senior research associate at the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk. Okay, I'm going to start off, if I can, with you in the studio. But first of all, I'm going to play out a quote that we have from Anders Rasmussen. He's the former NATO Secretary General, the man we're talking about today, and he has said this to journalists. If NATO cannot agree on a clear path forward for Ukraine, there is a clear possibility that some countries individually might take action. We know that Poland is very engaged in providing concrete assistance to Ukraine, and I wouldn't exclude the possibility that Poland would engage even stronger in this context on a national basis and be followed by the Baltic states, maybe including the possibility of troops on the ground. What do you make of that comment?
I think what the former Secretary-General is doing there, he's got clearly one eye on the NATO summit coming up next month in Vilnius, and he's trying to do his bit, if you like, as an influential private citizen now, but obviously an influential figure as a former NATO Secretary-General, former Prime Minister of Denmark. He's wanting to try to influence NATO leaders to form a united position in Vilnius with regard to two things. First of all, long-term military support for Ukraine, which could mean not just months but several years, potentially, depending on how things go with the counteroffensive. But also, probably the biggest issue that's going to be on the agenda for NATO in Vilnius is the question of Ukrainian membership. I think my own view is that it's no longer a question of if Ukraine joins, but there are still a lot of discussions to be had and a lot of questions to be resolved as to the modalities, to the how and the precisely when Ukraine joins, and how much preparation is going to be needed, not just on Ukraine's part, but how much NATO's existing members are going to have to assist it to enable it to get itself up to NATO standards. So I would view the Secretary-General's comments not necessarily, I wouldn't take them literally, I would view them in that context.
Colin, I'm going to bring this across to you. Would you agree with that? Do you think he was flying a kite to sort of see what the opinion would be around such a statement?
Yeah, I think that this is about posturing and him articulating, I think, his own viewpoint on this one, but also trying to prepare both the sort of global media, but also global publics to some extent as to what might be on the agenda, but what the outcomes might also be as well in terms of the future. Now, Martin's just mentioned that this conflict could rumble on for several more years, and I think that's quite an accurate place to be in terms of what we're seeing rolling out here. And so there has to be an element of caution here. This is likely not going to be a quick or a light fix. We're going to have to see sustained support if indeed Ukraine does at least move closer towards NATO membership, but also what does that actually mean in terms of the escalation of the conflict itself? Now that if indeed Ukraine became a member, and the obligation of the other members to defend Ukraine, and I think that leads us into a rather difficult question, should I say, in terms of loss of life and other matters.
Paul, what did you make of his comments when you first heard them?
When I first heard them, I was shocked and appalled because we have seen throughout this conflict a steady escalation in what's possible and what is not. And there seems to be a belief amongst many, including Anders himself, that we can just carry on ratcheting up. I fear a very slow and boring escalation, going to the point at which the Russians are with their backs completely against the wall. I've often been told that I shouldn't worry, that Putin and his people in the Kremlin would never use nuclear weapons. But I don't understand that confidence. It's a deeply irresponsible overconfidence. We on the one hand, seem to think that some incredibly bad people who are basically organized criminals who organize the Kremlin would never use nuclear weapons. And yet we ourselves are saying that we would use nuclear weapons in certain circumstances when we're meant to be the good guys, right? It doesn't make sense. And we do have to be extremely cautious about sending signals like this by a former Secretary General of NATO when it feeds right into the narrative of the Kremlin when they talk about NATO encircling Russia and threatening Russian existence. And I think it's a very sad day. And I do think that this former official of NATO is rather playing to the tune of his Ukrainian paymasters rather too much here.
Colin, I'm going to bring that back to you. I saw a lot of nodding there. How do you feel about that? Does this, if you like, help reinforce Vladimir Putin's narrative that he's been banging on about for the last 18 months, that Russia is somehow encircled, Russia should feel threatened, that kind of thing?
I mean, I think I'd like to broaden this out a little bit more around the general politics and the communication surrounding the use of nuclear weapons. I largely speaking, agree with what Paul said. There is a confirmation bias here that from the Cold War, that because we saw nuclear proliferation and we didn't have a nuclear conflict, that somehow human beings are not capable or are more rational than or perhaps we over-egg their rationality. We have to remember that the United States in 1945 under Harry S. Truman used nuclear weapons twice. And the twice part is actually quite important because they saw the devastation that happened the first time, and then they used them again 3 days later. So there's very much a confirmation bias here. It is well within the human capacity to use nuclear weapons. And indeed, if you ask any head of a nuclear state, would they be prepared to use nuclear weapons? They say yes. And again, that's quite problematic. You can argue on a kind of psychopathic level that they should be immediately removed from office because they're clearly unstable if they're demonstrating an intent to do this. But often the electorate see this as a sign of strength or a sign of decision-making prowess, and I think that's quite ill-founded.
Martin, let me bring this back over to you.
I agree with Paul that escalation is a fundamentally important issue, but I think I probably take a slightly more sanguine view of the risks of escalation. I think the bottom line problem is we don't know, and we in the West, in Ukraine, cannot know what Russia's ultimate red lines actually are. What we can
The real red lines, not the red lines, because they've said
Yes.
several times, we have a red line here, we have a red line here, we
there.
have a red line here.
Don't
they've
do
been
this,
crossed.
and this has been done, and they've been crossed, and not only has there been no pushback, but Russian leaders have stopped talking about the red lines. So I think the only thing we can conclude with any certainty, well, two things. Number one, we haven't reached the ultimate red line, if indeed there is one. And number two, there is perhaps more scope and space for relatively enhanced Western assistance to Ukraine. We might not have reached the upper limit as yet, because certainly my tracking of statements made by Mr. Putin and his generals and his senior political advisors is, if anything, references to Russia's nuclear capability, so the so-called nuclear threats that he allegedly has been making from time to time, they've actually decreased in number over the past 6 months or so, rather than increased. At conversely, the same time as the Western military aid and equipment programs have increased. So the main battle tanks, the infantry fighting vehicles earlier this year, and now the in-principle decision has quite clearly been made that over a period of months, some kind of F-16 force is going to be donated to Ukraine with appropriate training and configuration programs to support that. And all the while, Russia's red lines, if anything, seem to be receding rather than the Western aid and equipment program getting closer to them. So we don't know. It's not, we can't be so confident to say there isn't an ultimate red line, and the consequences of breaching the red line could indeed be serious, if not catastrophic, as Paul was saying. But the evidence so far would suggest not only are we not at that point yet in terms of the Western support for Ukraine, but we may indeed be a fair distance away from it.
Do you agree with Rasmussen then? Do you think that there will be... If I were being fatuous, if I were being a little bit glib, I could say, well, there already are NATO troops on the ground. Almost by definition, there'll be special forces in there on the ground. There'll be training people. There'll be other people in there sort of doing upkeep and logistics on some of the military equipment that's been sent. What Rasmussen is saying, that's already passed. That's a little bit glib. Mm-hmm. Is Rasmussen correct that there might be troops on the ground, as it were?
I think, personally, I think not. I think that is a clearly imposed NATO red line. And the risk of opening that discussion, that can of worms in a serious way at Vilnius, is that you begin, because there are clear differences of opinion amongst NATO members. So if you raise that issue, and certainly if you put it front and centre on NATO's collective agenda at the highest profile public event, i.e. a summit meeting, then you risk exacerbating those tensions and divisions, which is the very last thing that any NATO member state wants.
Right, well, we have another clip here. This one's an actual soundbite from Rasmussen himself. Here's what he had to say.
We are already stating that we are in this for as long as it takes. And this would send a very strong message to Putin that, Putin, forget it. You will never, ever win this war because we have guaranteed the security of Ukraine for as long as it takes. So forget it.
Paul, I was just asking a few seconds ago of Martin whether he thinks there actually will be NATO troops on the ground, regardless of whatever Rasmussen says. That quote sort of seems to indicate very strong language. Do you think NATO will eventually start putting troops on the ground or not?
No. I don't think that NATO would be foolish enough to take that sort of a step. If NATO troops are on the ground in any formal sense, then it means a strategic war between NATO and Russia, which is something that both sides have sought very strongly to avoid for very obvious and good reasons. I think it's deeply irresponsible for the former Secretary General to have said those words, and actually undermines many of the things he said when he was in office, which were all about alliance unity. He's now using an argument that actually talks about a group of states breaking away a coalition of the willing in order to support Ukraine on the ground, which is an act of defiance and breaking consensus within the alliance, which presumably, and certainly judging by his previous rhetoric, would be playing into the hands of the Russians rather than being hostile. So I think there's real problems here with everything he said. And I think we need to take a big step backwards and ask the question, how do we get out of this mess? And we do need to be thinking about security guarantees for Ukraine. It is a war which should never have happened, and the Russians do need to be pushed back somehow. But it doesn't actually take this sort of rhetoric to do that, because it just deepens and entrenches the conflict and ensures it carries on further. I think we need a new way of thinking here that is sorely lacking in most European capitals today.
Paul, let me put a subtly different question to you then. Why do you think he said these things? He must have known that this would be explosively powerful when he said it. And the moment he said it, he's not normally a sort of front-page news headlines kind of figure, but this news story has been picked up by almost everyone.
He said it because he is captured, as many people are in Europe, by the idea that deterrence works, and it works all the time, and the harder you threaten the punishment, the stronger the deterrent effect. They're basically engaging in the concept of escalation to de-escalate, which is what we have been accusing the Russians of all along. And we need a different tune. We need to be thinking rather about de-escalating and offering the Russians an off-ramp that involves coming together in talks for a ceasefire. Now, I know the Ukrainians are against that, and I understand why. And I think that the Ukrainians have suffered hugely, and they're looking for security guarantees. But they too need to be realistic and understand that security guarantees are not solid. And the only guarantee there is of security is if you create relationship with people, not divide them and fight wars against them. And that's what we need to be talking about. How do we overcome this conflict?
Let me take this across to Colin. Colin, why do you think he made these comments? They are particularly incendiary comments to make from a former politician who should be quite deft at this kind of thing.
I'm surprised by his comments. More broadly, though, from a political communications point of view, any commitment on the part of the British, the French, whoever else, to put troops on the ground in Ukraine, that would require a significant propaganda campaign in these countries to essentially explain why we are risking the lives of usually young men, and for what purpose. So there would have to be a reframing of the Ukraine conflict as essentially a key threat to the viability of the UK, for example. And at the moment, this is still seen as a relatively distant conflict, which we clearly have vested interest in, but we would have to see it as being a clear threat to us. I'm in the UK, so I'll refer to it as us. And right now, we don't have that. You can't just chuck some troops in, or you can't just chuck some sort of British troops in. This would have to be at least 6 months or to a year in the making in order to achieve that.
Right, Martin, let me bring you in there. So what do you think of that, looking at Rasmussen's comments through that lens? Is this an early attempt to sort of begin to get, I would say NATO members, but actually more European Union and UK members of the public interested in the Ukraine situation and get them used to the idea that the soldiers might actually have to go?
I think it's more, rather than an early attempt, I think it's part of a continuing series of attempts to try to ensure that the basic, widespread political and popular consensus, both in the United States and widely amongst pretty well every European NATO member state, some more overtly than others. But even the so-called recalcitrant, so Hungary and Turkey, when push comes to shove and the big decisions need to be made, they are there and they have been on side. So I wouldn't see it as being a sort of first shot across the bows for any new specific ramping up. More, there's been a lot of debate, as I'm sure you're aware, continuing debate, and Mr. Putin believes that all he has to do is to stay the course and he'll outlast the West, and if Donald Trump comes back into power in the United States may well take a fundamentally different view about supporting Ukraine, and so on and so forth. Personally, I've seen little evidence of any significant diminution of either political will or wider public support for the effort in Ukraine so far. But of course, that doesn't mean that 3, 4, 5, 6 months down the line, or by this time next year, depending on the counteroffensive, how the counteroffensive goes, that the situation might not have changed. So I would suggest we may be best advised to see these deliberately eye-catching, yes, incendiary for some comments by senior figures, such as the former NATO Secretary General. He knew what he was saying. I think one thing we can all agree on is he didn't misspeak.
This wasn't a gaffe.
This wasn't a gaffe. This was very, very deliberately done at a particular point in time, shortly before the NATO Vilnius summit. And Colin obviously knows far more about political communication than I do, but it seems apparent to me that what he what he is probably in his own mind sees himself as doing is making a contribution to that continuing alliance-wide effort to shore up and maintain the degree and depth of support, so that if Mr. Putin's calculation is ultimately we will outlast you and then Ukraine will have to come to terms, our terms, then that is not going to happen.
Let me bring this over to you, Paul. Now, you mentioned, obviously, the 1960s, 70s, early 80s strategy of escalate to de-escalate, which, sort of became increasingly popular, and we've been accusing Russia of engaging in it. If we wanted to genuinely de-escalate the situation, what would your recommendations be for how to go about that? Clearly not saying, hey, lads, let's send the troops in.
No. It's about using the influence that we do have across Europe, including Turkey and London and places like this, to encourage ceasefire talks and thinking now about what that means in terms of how to create a situation where the Russians feel secure, where the Ukrainians feel secure, where there is a negotiation of the interests involved. We were quite close to that in the first few months of the war, but I think once Ukraine received large quantities of Western material and saw an opportunity to try to push Russia out of the territories that it had invaded, there was less appetite for that. We need to encourage people to look at the opportunities for negotiations now, and that does include sitting down and considering seriously security guarantees. It may even include membership of NATO by Ukraine at some point. This is not about caving into Russia's demands and saying everything that Russia needs, but in many respects, the Ukrainians have already won. This is a conflict that has been going on for hundreds of years, and the sympathies towards Russia in those parts of Ukraine that have been occupied has been drifting away from Russia for some time. This is lost in so many ways by Russia for the long term, but we need to actually cash those chips in rather than keep fighting this war and seeing ever increasing humanitarian consequences, including particularly the destruction of this dam, which I think is a massive escalation in the conflict, which we should not underestimate. What could happen next? I'm not threatening nuclear weapons next, but there could be all sorts of damage that could be done to civilian infrastructure, with the consequent lives both in Ukraine, Northern Africa, and across the world. Food prices are going up as we speak, and I think this is something that we absolutely need to bring to an end. And this is not just the Ukrainians on their own that needs to move.
Colin, are you in the escalate to de-escalate camp, or do you have another path that you would prefer to see?
It's a mistake to think that propaganda is a part of warfare or a consequence of conflict. Propaganda is fundamental to conflict in the sense of it cannot happen unless we have propaganda. So one of the ways in which you de-escalate this conflict is by making the war scene in its totality unacceptable. Unacceptable in the minds of publics around the world, and also unacceptable in the minds of the soldiers and the other combatants who are fighting. If there's a public will towards the ending of conflict and an expression that war in all its forms is barbaric, then we may well have increased political pressure to solve it. And this is where then, but I think that what I've just said is kind of the platform upon which Paul's more sort of strategic or diplomatic discussion has to sit.
Right, Martin, let me bring this across to you. One final thing we haven't touched upon, the current person in charge of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, as he sort of sits in the role, he's already had his period in office extended once. He's coming to the end of that extension. At some stage, NATO's either going to have to stick with him again, ask him to hang around, or they're going to have to find someone new to come in. Is this comment, given its strength and the amount of focus that it's had from a former or an ex-head of NATO, is this tied up with that in any way? Because there will be some people looking at it and wondering if that's where the comment has come from.
I suspect probably not. And in terms of Mr. Stoltenberg's future, I think it's been interesting to my own view is it doesn't make any sense for NATO to the NATO horse, if you like, to change jockeys at this particular juncture in the race, in inverted commas. And I think it's been interesting to note that in the media just over the past few days, various NATO member states have been letting it be known informally that they would favour Mr. Stoltenberg staying on, at least until the end of the Ukraine conflict, rather than having to change horses in midstream. So he's keeping his cards close to his chest. He's not giving anything away. I personally wouldn't be entirely surprised if one of the announcements at Vilnius is that he's agreed to have his term extended again. Martin,
Colin, Paul, thank you very much, all three of you, for joining me. That is all we have time for today. Remember, though, you can see more discussion and debate if you head on over to our YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me here and the entire team, thank you for watching and goodbye.